Welcome to video 2. In video 1 we looked at how to create a random hex color code using OCR exam reference language. Today we're going to move on to Python, but before I do that I wanted to consider other different exam boards. For example, obviously you can see in front of you I've just copied and pasted the OCR exam reference language. In AQA and GCSE, for example, they use a slightly different type of pseudocode. You'll notice here that they use a left arrow for assignment, and that's because they use a single equal for comparison, which is for equal to, and an equal with a slash through it for not equal to. Instead of function, they use subroutine or procedure, depending upon whether it returns a value or not. In terms of Edexcel, they no longer have their own pseudocode guide. They use what's known as a programming language subset, or PLS for short, and effectively that is a subset of the Python language. And the Python that we're going to write today will be included in all of the PLS. So let's get started. We have the pseudocode in front of us, and today we're using Visual Studio because I'm going to be coding in Python, Visual Basic, and also in C#, and it just makes it easy for me to switch between them. So let's start. So the first thing we need to remember is that in Python our comments are using a hash. We know that we don't need a function that in Python, whether it's a function or a procedure, it's simply use the keyword def. And we don't need an end function, but I think it's important to keep the end def in this case in, because it allows us to very clearly see the code blocks. Now we can see that we've got a squiggly underline in red here, and that's because of course Python requires a colon for an indented code block. This code here, lookup equals this string, that's exactly the same code in Python. However, to get a random number in Python, if you remember, and this is all in the PLS guide document that comes with the exam, we need to do import random, and importing random will then allow us to do a random and use a method on that random class, which is randint, and just as we would with the OCR exam reference language, we have 0 to 15. Then this code here, we use the same way of indexing an array, and remember that a string is simply an array of characters or a list of characters, as that is how in the PLS the map from an array goes to a Python list, and we simply return the same way. So we didn't have to make a huge amount of change to this code once we've got the understanding of it. And if again you don't understand how this code works, you should go back to video 1 and look at how we did that in pseudocode. So let's move on to the next function. We're going to do a def, and I'm simply going to comment that end def here. And don't forget, for our code block, we need to have a colon. Of course, string assignment is exactly the same, so nothing is going to change here. Nothing is going to change here because this is just assigning a value of a function to a variable, and this is simply concatenating two strings together, which is exactly the same. So the only thing that we need to consider is the for loop, and we know in order to do things a number of times in Python, we can change this to be for I in range, and we will have 6, and that effectively gives us 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Don't forget our colon. Now, of course, in Python, if we're not actually using the variable, we can just use the underscore, but I think it's better to put it like this. And don't forget, we don't need the next C in Python, but I think it's important to put at least a next with a comment at the bottom so we can see the code block. So we can then return that color string and everything should be in order. There's no change to our code here. Then of course we are simply assigning the return value from getHexColor to random color, and we're printing random color. And so with a bit of luck, if I restart that now, let's see what we get. We should be just waiting a moment. You can see that we get a 6-digit string starting with a hash. I'll just run that one more time. And we can see that we are now getting that. So we've now converted that pseudocode to Python. For those of you that came here just to look at how to convert that pseudocode to Python, then you can finish now. However, for those of you that are interested, I'm just going to go over two things. One is how in-range works and how you can use that in other scenarios. And secondly, at the end of the first video, I talked about how you could use the command chr and ASC in order to do this particular procedure or function a third way. So we're going to have a look at that, and we'll do that first. So how can we use those figures? Well, in Python, these two are actually represented in the chr command and the ORD. So ASC in OCR reference language or in pseudocode. In Python, it's ORD, which is short for the ordinal, and CHR is the same, it's just in lowercase. So how does that work? Well, the ordinal will get the ASCII number value for a particular character or symbol. So I'm just going to say here, capital A is equal to the ORD of capital A. And I'm just going to print, whoops, we want that in lowercase, print capital A. Now you'll notice that I'm using uppercase letters here because we're defining this as a constant. I'm just going to comment out this print line here so we only get to see the result of those two lines of code. And you'll notice that what we get is the number 65 because the ASCII A is 65, B or capital B is 66, and so on. So we can either leave that now as ORD A, but given that we know that it's 65, I'm just going to replace that with 65. Now we talked about the fact that we don't need to worry about this particular piece of code because the only thing that we are trying to do is change this and make sure we return a hex digits. So what do we need to do? Well, we certainly don't need to do a lookup anymore, and obviously what we're going to do is set our hex digit to be initialized as an empty string. Now if you watch the first video, we use an if, else if, else if, else if, else, and there were quite a number of else if, one for B, one for C, one for D, one for E, and then we use E or else for F. In this case, we're just going to use an if and an else. So we can say exactly the same thing, is that if the random value is less than 10, what we want to do is say that our hex digit is equal to the string value, remembering that random.randint returns an integer, and we're simply converting that to a string so that we can return it. If it's not less than 10, what do we need to do? Well, this is where maths come in and logic. This is not really about computer programming anymore. This is about logic. We know that the number 10 is A, and so we're looking for the numbers 10 upwards to 15. So if we take, let's just select a variable name, I'm going to call it ASCII number, and we take the current random value, which is we now know is going to be greater than 10 and less than or equal to 15, and so we can take 10 off it. So if the random number is 10, 10 minus 10 will give me 0, 11 minus 10 will give me 1, 12 minus 10 will give me 2, etc. If we then add on to that our base capital A, let's think about what's happening here. If we have the number 10, 10 minus 10 is 0, plus 65, well 65 we know is that capital A. So if we have the number 11, 11 minus 10 is 1, 1 plus 65 gives me 66, and 66 is capital B. So what we can now do is we can say that the hex digit is equal to the character of that ASCII number. And just to make sure that we have a closing end block, remember not all IDEs will give you this nice dotted line. I'm just going to put again end if, so that again when I'm switching between pseudocode and Python, I'm not forgetting that we should put in the end if. And so now we have some code here which we haven't had to change this. This is essentially, this first part is the same code as the option 2 that we did in video 1. And let's see what happens when we run this code. And nothing has happened, and the reason for nothing has happened is because I forgot to uncomment out this print statement. So let's have a look again. Just waiting for it, and we can now see we've got our 6-digit hex string. So I've now shown you 3 different ways to create a random hex digits, and we've just simply used that function within our other function where we've looped 6 times. Now of course sometimes it's not quite clear what range does, because if you look at the programming language subset, you will see that there is an option for I in and then an array of objects. And whilst it's not quite the same as an array, range is essentially just equivalent to an array, or conceptually the same as an array. So I'm just going to comment this line out again here, but just to show you, I'm going to say x is equal to range of 6, as we have here, and I'm just going to print x, and let's see what we get when we do that. And we get this weird thing that says range 0,6, and we have to remember that if we put one single value in our range, what it actually does is says I want to start at 0, go up to but not including, in this case 6, with a step size of 1. But if we convert this to a list, what we actually have here is something called an iterable, something that you can iterate through or loop through. So if I convert this to a list and now print x, you'll see that what we have here is an array or a list 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So conceptually, this line here effectively simply says for C in 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And so first time round C is 0, the second time round it's 1. And it looks like we're doing a for loop, but in reality it's just looping through each of the items in this list. So we can create any lists, and it will essentially loop through the items, and C in this first case will be 12, then 1, then 12, then 23. It doesn't have to be numbers, it can be James, Bob, Sally, and because you're simply looping through each value in this list. So when we do for I in range, it simply means this. It's the equivalent of this. And so that's how range works, and that's how you can use for in using an array, for example, to loop through a list of passwords or a list of records which hold a password and a username. So hopefully that explains a little bit more about range. Hopefully you explained a little bit more about how we can do the random hex digit in another way. and we've also seen how to convert some pseudocode to the Python language.